Welcome to the first episode of the Joe Squared podcast. This is Joe Anderson, and I'm kindly joined by my close friend, Joe Murray. Thanks for coming on.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. The order of the day is neuroscience, in particular what it has to say about consciousness, but we'll talk about how it interacts with philosophy and cognitive psychology. We'll address the illusion of consciousness according to various thinkers, and before we'll conclude, we'll mention Dan Dennett and Giulio Tononi's theoretical models of consciousness and the direction of future research on the topic. We'll begin by attempting to define consciousness and making some distinctions and clarifications about what we're aiming to discuss, namely what philosopher David Chalmers coined the easy and hard problems. Transitioning chronologically, we'll review the history of neuroscience and move on to modern technology and methods of studying consciousness. Firstly, an introduction. I study psychology at Christ Church Uni, having a particular interest in neuroscience and cognitive psychology, but have been interested in the neuroscience of consciousness for much longer due to my background in philosophy. And why don't you briefly introduce yourself, Joe, before we delve in any further?
It's always great to talk with you, and I'm sure this one will be especially informative. So, I completed my master's degree in management at the University of Nottingham with a dissertation on emotional contagion in the workplace, which looked at the relationship between business and psychology. Although not directly related, the question of what consciousness is and why it exists at all is one of the most relevant and intriguing issues one can think about, and I'm also interested to hear what you've researched.
Chalmers points out that there isn't anything we know about more directly, yet it's simultaneously the most mysterious phenomenon in the universe. It is the source of all happiness, suffering, and anything else we care about. But how do we define it?
It's very difficult to formally define consciousness because it's impossible to categorize or operationalize. For example, red is a color, or a pen is used to write with. Perhaps as scientific understanding of the brain and its psychological mechanisms develops, understanding of how conscious experience emerges will become more obvious. To get around the lack of technical definition, we use the so-called working definition to make sure we're not getting distracted and talking about something similar to consciousness. An early attempt at such a definition was by William James in 1890, arguably the father of American psychology. He suggested that consciousness is the integration of our senses, but it is limited by our attention and develops in sync with perception. Modern working definitions are something like the presence of any subjective experience whatsoever. That's Seth's.
Seth suggests that our subjective experience is a continuous, controlled hallucination, and that when we all agree on our hallucinations, we call that reality. Dan Dennett provides an analogy between consciousness and magic, arguing that various integrated psychological mechanisms generate an illusion of conscious experience. Sam Harris would also agree that both our perception and self-perception are illusory, as he does in his 2012 book Free Will. But Seth goes on to argue that conscious experience is derived from perceiving the world around us and ourselves. But how does it work? He asks you to imagine you're a brain trying to understand your surroundings. After sense organs deliver a signal to you, the only thing you can operate on are electrical impulses, but how do these generate any subjective, private, and conscious experience?
Before we talk about the science, I know you wanted to bring up some distinctions in terminology.
That's right. So there are three main distinctions that I want to note here. The biggest confusion is with self-consciousness. The idea of the self is not necessary for an organism to be conscious, but it is an addition. Seth argues that consciousness is not linked to intelligence. Therefore, artificial intelligence becoming conscious one day is unlikely. One method we can use to assess self-awareness is the mirror test. An animal is anesthetized and a mark painted on its forehead. When it wakes up, it's given access to a mirror, and if it touches or investigates the mark in any way, it's taken as an indication of self-awareness. But Joe, what age do you think a human child would pass the mirror test?
Actually, I have no idea. Maybe 3 or 4?
So you might be surprised then to learn that infants as young as 18 months old, apes, elephants, and dolphins all pass the mirror test. But the second distinction I want to make is in 1995, where Ned Block first differentiated between phenomenal and access consciousness. Phenomenal is the sensory experience of the world, and access consciousness is what our brains are able to process, the cognitive element. Finally, and most importantly, specific and generic consciousness. Specific consciousness is essentially the content of subjective experience, the accumulation of all senses and cognition. which can be looked at in terms of neural connections and pathways, and generic consciousness refers to the level, which sleep and anesthesia illustrate very well. We can use bispectral index technology to monitor and adjust the depth of anesthesia, which implies that depth and level of consciousness have been generally understood for many years. This technology has immense benefits, including reducing the incidence of anesthesia-related deaths and intraoperative awareness. This is where you recover enough to have sensory experience during surgery, but not enough to control your body or alert someone to your situation. As you can imagine, this is a truly harrowing experience. But when we do this monitoring, Susan Greenfield demonstrates that all sections of the brain shut down simultaneously, showing that there is not any one area in particular responsible for consciousness.
Would you please explain the historical development of neuroscience and when we were first able to study consciousness scientifically before we look at the results of those experiments?
So some people actually argue that a science of consciousness is impossible because science is objective by definition and we're trying to study a fundamentally subjective phenomenon. Nevertheless, research in the previous few decades has immensely improved our understanding of it. However, non-scientific studies of the brain and nervous system date back to ancient Egypt, where the function of the brain was essentially cranial stuffing. It was often removed in preparation for mummification because it was believed that the heart was at the seat of intelligence, hence the expression to memorize by heart. But this view was reversed in ancient Greece, where dissection of the eye linked vision to the brain. After this, it was suggested that it was in fact the brain that controlled the body and senses. Avicenna was arguably the father of modern medicine, who wrote an encyclopedia explaining a variety of mental states, including insomnia, hallucinations, dementia, mania, and many others. And Descartes' dualist theory of the mind was highly influential in philosophical understanding of consciousness, but progress really got started after the development of a staining procedure using silver nitrate developed by Italian biologist Camillo Golgi in the late 1800s. It works by leaving a black deposit on parts of the cell, providing a clear contrast between neurons and surrounding cells, revealing the structure of individual neurons, which was groundbreaking at the time. Research methods have constantly improved throughout the 20th century, providing much better methods to study the brain. But before we get into that, we should be clear about what we aim to do today.
As you mentioned earlier, it was cognitive psychologist and philosopher David Chalmers who termed the easy and hard problems of consciousness. The hard problem is understanding why conscious experience exists at all. Jay Shapiro recently produced audio documentaries exploring Sam Harris's view on consciousness, in which he proposes that it's perfectly feasible to live in a universe which followed the laws of physics, but without any subjective experience. Greenfield phrases the hard problem as trying to explain the difference between unconsciousness and wakefulness. This implicates the existence of philosophical zombies, or P-zombies, which I know you don't like the idea of.
So a P-zombie is a thought experiment introduced by Robert Kirk, which asks you to imagine a being physically identical to and indistinguishable from a human, but lacks any conscious experience, qualia, or sentience. Philosopher Thomas Metzinger famously explains how he is thoroughly unimpressed by the ability to imagine such a thing, and warns us from ever attempting to build one. But Seth proposes the intuition gap of the hard problem may be reduced by pursuing the easy problems and studying how the brain works.
Chalmers, however, suggests three potential radical solutions to the hard problem. The first is that consciousness is fundamental, comparable to the laws of physics like gravity, quantum mechanics, etc. The second is that it's universal, that consciousness is everywhere, all around us, and our brains are like satellite dishes receiving the data. This view is also known as panpsychism, and Chalmers argues that if it's fundamental, it makes sense to think it's also universal. The third idea comes from Dan Dennett, who argues that there is no hard problem. He says that our inner subjective movie is an illusion, and all we need to do is explain the objective functions and behaviors of a brain, and we'll have explained conscious experience. This is what's known in philosophical jargon as a reductionist approach.
So here I agree more with Dennett, Seth and Metzinger that the hard problem is either non-existent or will sort of answer itself or dissolve itself as we learn more about the brain.
I'm more taken in by the hard problem than you are, as I think Harris and Chalmers make compelling arguments that even if you grant that P-zombies are conceptually impossible, we don't have any satisfactory and falsifiable hypothesis on why consciousness exists at all.
Although we disagree on the existence of a hard problem, we both agree that it isn't very helpful to dwell on. So today we will be exploring the easy problem and placing panpsychism aside. The easy problem is the task of explaining how all of the different psychological functions and mechanisms work within the brain. In essence, understanding the brain in its entirety. Joe, are you aware of any methods within neuroscience to study the brain and start answering the easy problem?
I know of the two common ways that we study the brain. The top-down approach includes medical imaging such as functional magnetic resonance imaging, also known as fMRI. This works by measuring oxygenated and deoxygenated blood in the brain, as they have different magnetic properties. This enables us to monitor neuronal activity in the tens of millions, showing entire brain regions, but spatial resolution is broad. The time resolution is several seconds, which is slow compared to the bottom-up approach. The bottom-up approach, formerly known as electrophysiology, involves inserting electrodes into brain tissue and recording small populations of neurons, looking at the change in voltage across a cell or tissue. It has high time resolution, within milliseconds, but it only looks at specific cells.
Two other common methods are case studies of brain damage in clinical psychology, looking at correlations between altered conscious experience and brain structure and activity, and computational models can be used to generate both artificial and biological neural networks, which we can extrapolate from. But as you mentioned, electrophysiology is too specific to explain consciousness, and fMRI is too vague. So Susan Greenfield is able to provide a neuroscientific explanation of the nature of subjective conscious experience. Firstly, a neuronal assembly or matrix, depending on who you talk to, is a variable sub-second group of neurons as large as 10 million. Greenfield uses voltage-sensitive dye imaging, which works by embedding itself in the membrane of a cell and changing spectral properties in response to voltage. This provides clear, linear measurements of neuronal activity in large populations. The downside is that it's only used on rodents, as we can't risk putting potentially toxic dye on a human brain. To better understand this, she provides an analogy of a stone being thrown into a puddle. The stone can vary in size and force. The force is sensory, such as an alarm clock or a bright light, and the size is the magnitude of cognition. This is associated with the neural network and connections between brain cells. But neuronal assemblies on their own aren't enough to significantly correlate with subjective experience. They're too local, long-lasting, and slow-forming. This is where modulators come in. Modulators are chemicals which predispose cells to be more sensitive to stimuli, enabling the recruitment of additional cells even after the quasi-permanent pathways of cells have been made. Greenfield summarizes them as giving a varied response to invaried stimuli, and she proposes that her findings generate an index of consciousness.
So, as far as I understand it, large-scale and fast-paced groups of neurons are affected by sensory and cognitive stimuli, how big the stone is and how hard it's thrown. And although the neural connections are semi-permanent, modulation makes you more or less receptive to certain electrical signals.
That's correct, and this theory was actually replicated on human brains at Manchester University by Professor Brian Pollard using something called functional electrical impedance tomography by evoked response, or theta, which supported Greenfield's hypothesis.
And what's the difference between small and large assembly states?
That's a really good question. So, small assembly states are associated with being easily distracted and disturbed, having a short attention span and an underfunctioning prefrontal cortex. We see these in children where there's modest connectivity as the prefrontal cortex develops late in teenage years, in dreaming where there's weak sensory stimuli, in schizophrenia where there's abnormal modulation of dopamine which inhibits activity in the prefrontal cortex, and in fast-paced sports where you've got simultaneously competing assemblies. And large neural assemblies are found in cases where the outside world feels remote, one's senses are understimulated and feels a numbing of emotion, and this is linked to depression. But most studies only look at neurons, and there are some very interesting cells which look promising for future research and understanding of the brain and of consciousness, and I'm aware that you've done some research into them.
That's right. Recent studies in the early 2000s showed that for every 85 neurons in the human brain, there are 100 glial cells, which control the number of synapses between neurons, guiding them in particular ways, which, as you say, may play a larger role in neuroscience than what was previously assumed. Fun fact, there are an estimated 86 billion neurons in the human brain, and there are more neurons in the cerebellum than in the rest of the brain combined.
Before we conclude with computational theories of consciousness, we should explain how the brain works from the cognitive and perceptual experiments from Seth and Dennett. Seth argues that our consciousness is an illusion in two ways, a perception of the world and of ourselves. This is because both perception and interoception of our bodies has a lot to do with best guesses of sensory inputs and whether the internal body is functioning well or not.
Dan Dennett very eloquently illustrates this using the example of a Bellotto painting where there is no detail when you get up close, but from afar your brain takes a suggestion, as he puts it. Seth also uses various illusions to demonstrate that our brains are essentially prediction machines, a term I believe Dan Dennett used in another talk. The first is Edward Adelson's differently appearing shades of squares, which are in fact the same colour. This is because our brains predict the shadow of a green cylinder to change the shade of squares. The second is an audio illusion, which enables our brains to make sense of previously incomprehensible audio once we've heard a fitting example. As Seth is also a computational neuroscientist, he carried out an experiment with a computer simulation which exaggerated perceptual predictions at Sussex University campus. These illustrate the idea that our brains don't know for sure what the real world is, and they have their only electrical impulses to go on once you get past the eyes or ears. Everything is essentially a best guess of what's really there, and when these guesses do not align with everyone else's, we call it hallucination.
In fact, he goes on to argue that even the specific experience of being you is also a controlled hallucination.
But Joe, how could I be deceived about being me?
So he puts forward 5 ways of being a self: having a body, perceiving the world, and your own body for that matter, from a first person perspective. There's the intention to do things and causing things to happen, and the experience of being a continuous and distinctive person over time, which is built from various social interactions and memories. These apparently unified ways of being a self can all come apart. One neuroscientific experiment you can actually do from home to test this is the fake arm experiment. If you hide someone's real hand from their view and put a fake hand where the real hand should be, after stroking both the fake and real hand simultaneously, it results in the sensation of this feeling like it's your hand. This shows that even experiences of what our body is are best guesses or controlled hallucinations.
Seth actually did another experiment looking at the internal perception and regulation of a body, known as interoception. Using virtual reality, hands would flash red either in time or out of time with their heartbeat. When it flashed in time, people have a stronger sense that the hand is part of their body.
Now let's talk about theoretical models of consciousness and how it works in the brain. I believe there are 8, but we only have time to talk about a couple. I'll start with Daniel Dennett's multiple drafts model, a physicalist theory of consciousness. The multiple drafts model proposes that the brain generates different explanations of events, which are in turn affected by subsequent events. The brain then continuously reinterprets these explanations in a way that may affect what we thought we believed. The multiple drafts model postulates that what we think and believe at any given time depends on various subsystems, which may each have different interpretations. The prevailing thought or belief is the majority opinion of all involved subsystems.
Giulio Tononi, in 2004, developed a mathematical model for information integration theory. It claimed that consciousness is identical to a certain kind of information, the realization of which requires physical integration and which can be measured mathematically according to the phi metric. IIT takes neuroscientific descriptions of the brain as a starting point for understanding what must be true of a physical system in order for it to be conscious.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for this episode. In summary, we've talked about what consciousness is, the history of neuroscience and modern methods to observe the brain. We've looked at the illusion of consciousness and briefly mentioned some of the computational models, which will be important in future research. For additional reading, I highly recommend more of Greenfield's work on neuronal assemblies, Dan Dennett on the magic of consciousness, and Sir Roger Penrose on the quantum physics of consciousness. To the audience, thank you for listening, and Joe, thank you for joining. See you next time, and goodbye.